Part of my role here at IU is to promote international research partnerships and collaboration. And so it is a pleasure to host this event for the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, which shares that mission. In addition, more personally, as a former Humboldt Fellow myself, I am an enthusiastic supporter of the foundation and its American Friends organization. We have many Humboldt alums at IU and throughout the state of Indiana, and it's an honor to convene here today. In today's event, we will interrogate the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the present, that response includes various forms of humanitarian assistance. And I just want to take a moment to recognize the important role that universities can and indeed must play in helping to support our colleagues in Ukraine. Here at IU, our Russian and East European Institute has spearheaded a non-residential fellowship program that is currently providing 33 Ukrainian scholars with the financial support, access to digital journals and books, and research network that is permitting them to continue their work. In the future, the response to Russia's invasion will turn also to international law and the mechanisms to achieve justice in Ukraine. I am delighted to welcome our distinguished panel, Ambassadors Haber, Markarova, and Beth, along with my colleagues, Sumit Ganguly and Tim Waters. I will now turn the virtual podium over to Christian Hennel, the president of the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Christian?
Thank you very much, Hannah. Ambassador Markarova, Ambassador von Schaack, Ambassador Haber, Hannah, Šumit, Tim, ladies and gentlemen in Bloomington and via Zoom. My name is Christian Hennel. I'm the president of the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. My plan was to welcome you in person, on site in Bloomington today. I was very much looking forward to that, not least because I'm a basketball fanatic, and as such, I always wanted to pay a visit to Hoosier country. Unfortunately, United Airlines preferred not to fly as planned this morning, so I have to attend virtually. We're going to have a conversation about responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The topic could not be more relevant. What is happening to our friends in Ukraine in their fight against Russian aggression is the most urgent issue, geopolitically and humanitarian. We cannot have enough events like the one we're having today because the world needs to learn everything about this, the world needs to stay focused on this, and the world needs to deal with this. I am originally from Germany. Kiev is a 2-hour flight from Berlin. That's about the same time it takes to fly, if flights go as scheduled, from Indianapolis to Washington, D.C. Kiev is in the middle of Europe, and what is at stake in Ukraine affects us all, from Berlin to Washington to Indiana and beyond. Today's event is truly transatlantic. Ukraine, the United States, and Germany will be represented on the panel. Thank you so much again, dear ambassadors, for being with us today. And with this event, we will tell the story of what is happening in Ukraine to an audience across the Atlantic and across the United States. We're here, or actually you're there, in Bloomington, in the middle of the country. At Indiana University, we're way beyond the beltway of Washington, D.C. And this is good because Ukraine's story has an impact that goes way beyond borders and bubbles. The mission of the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation is to foster transatlantic exchange and cooperation, transatlantic cooperation in science, research, and in public policy. American Friends of Humboldt is honored to be a partner in this event today. And if you're interested in finding out more about American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, please contact us. If you want to promote transatlantic exchange and cooperation in whatever sector or field you're working in, partner with us. Reach out to us and we can create meaningful transatlantic impact together. I wish all of us an inspiring event. Thank you very much.
very good afternoon to our three ambassadors who have taken time out from their exceedingly busy schedules to join us this afternoon. And it is most unfortunate that Christian could not be here in person, but obviously he will be with us for the entire time today. I'm Sumit Ganguly, a distinguished professor of political science here at Indiana University in Bloomington and a former Humboldtian at the University of Heidelberg. And I'm delighted to play a very small role in this event. I am going to briefly introduce our speakers in the order of their appearance, but I did want to make just a preliminary remark, namely that last month, while at the Munich Security Conference, Vice President Kamala Harris unequivocally stated that in the case of Russia's actions in Ukraine, we have examined the evidence, we know the legal standard, and there is no doubt these are crimes against humanity. And consequently, this seminar, this meeting is of extraordinary significance. I will briefly now introduce our three ambassadors. Ambassador Oksana Markarova was appointed as Ukraine's ambassador to the US in 2021. Prior to being ambassador, she served in Ukraine's Ministry of Finance from 2015 to 2020 as first deputy minister and government commissioner on investments and as a minister of finance. I could continue with her very long curriculum vitae, but that would be more suitable for a Senate filibuster, given its sheer length. And so I'm going to compress it and simply mention that she is also a proud IU graduate. I'll next turn to Ambassador Emily Haber, whose accomplishments are no less significant or extensive. She's been the German ambassador to the United States since June 2018. Prior to her arrival in Washington, D.C., she served in various leadership functions at the Foreign Office in Berlin. In 2009, she was appointed political director, and in 2011, state secretary, the first woman to hold either post. Thereafter, she was deployed in the Federal Ministry of the Interior, serving as Secretary of State in charge of Homeland Security and Migration Policy from 2014 to 2018. Again, her accomplishments are quite extensive, well beyond what I've mentioned, but in the interests of time, I am only highlighting the most significant ones. Finally, but hardly the least, Ambassador Beth van Schaack was sworn in as the State Department's sixth ambassador at large for global criminal justice in March of 2022. In this role, she advises the Secretary of State and other department leadership on issues related to the prevention and response to atrocity crimes, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Ambassador van Schaack previously served as deputy to the ambassador at large in the GCJ from 2012 to 2013. Once again, this is a highly abbreviated version of her extensive CV, but in keeping in mind that time is indeed compressed, I am being forced to trim the most extensive accomplishments of these three individuals. I'm going to now hand over the baton to my colleague, Professor Timothy Waters, who's a professor of law and the Van Nolen Faculty Fellow at Indiana University, and like myself, a former Humboldtian, who spent his fellowship at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative and Public International Law, also at the marvelous University of Heidelberg. Just on a housekeeping note, I want to mention that there are notepads in your folders for questions. If you do have questions, and I imagine many of you will, please write out the questions as legibly as possible. And then Jessica Hamilton, who's towards the back of the room, will collect the questions and hand them to us to direct to the three extraordinary individuals whom you see on the screen before you. Without any further ado, Tim.
Okay, thank you very much, Šumit, and thanks to all the organizers, Christian, thanks to Hannah for her comments as well. And thanks also to Jessica. I did indeed have a Humboldt Fellowship. I was very honored to have that and was therefore delighted when Jessica approached me about taking part in this event. I was very happy to do it, and her efforts have been extraordinary in bringing this together. So thank you to her as well. So I've got the pleasant task, intimidating task of asking the questions to our three distinguished guests. And sort of by agreement, what we're going to do is first have a general question put to all three of the ambassadors. The order I've proposed is Ambassador Markarova, Ambassador Haber, and then Ambassador von Schaack. And then a second round where each one of them will have a question specifically put to her. Although, of course, we'll welcome any of the three intervening on any of those questions afterwards as they like. We've got about 45 minutes for this section. So I'm imagining people's answers would be best at 5 to 7 minutes. Let's see how that goes. All right. And then afterwards, as was mentioned, we'll have a chance for the audience to put some questions as well. So I'd like to start, as I said, first with Ambassador Markarova, then Ambassador Haber and Schaack. And the first question, which we've agreed to discuss, has to do with war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I would note at the outset, I'm going to ask another question in a little while regarding aggression. So I'd like to focus this on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide as much as possible. But here's the question. What would you say, and I'm starting with Ambassador Markarova, what would you say to the argument that the time for war crimes trials or trials of crimes against humanity is after the war and not during it? So specifically, that in addition to all the practical challenges that we could imagine about holding trials right now, is there any danger of subordinating a project that is supposed to be about neutral legal justice to political agendas, to a war agenda? Are there things we should be doing now and other things that we really must or should wait to do after the war? So, Ambassador Markarova, please.
Yes, thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be back to Bloomington, even by Zoom. But I really hope to be back soon on campus, which I really loved. It's my 2 best years, and I'm a very devoted Hoosier and Spion. So, very important question, which actually we discussed a lot after Russia reinvaded us on the February 24th, and after literally 9 years of war, hot phase in 2014, 2015, and then all kinds of hybrid attacks that we suffered from Russian Federation. And while we worked on diplomatic solution in order to restore territorial integrity, and Russia was preparing to attack us, on the 24th, all the legal forces in Ukraine were also put together. And that was the question that we have discussed a lot. And the decision we have taken to do everything possible to seek justice now, not to wait until the end of the war. And I will expand a little bit on why we think that decision is not only the right decision, but also the very efficient and effective decision. We all know the famous phrase, justice delayed is justice denied. But of course, it's the reason is much bigger than that. So this war in Ukraine, and we Ukrainians knew that we would not surrender, we would not give up, we will fight. This war is also unique in a sense, comparing to other wars, because there was no a day during this war, during this 378 days now, more than a year, that Ukrainian government was not functioning everywhere in Ukraine, of course, except for the territories which Russians occupy and keep under their control. So our Prosecutor General's office, our investigators, our court system continued to operate and to operate according to all the standards, not only Ukrainian, but international standards. Therefore, to prosecute the war crimes and the crime of related to war crimes, and also crimes against national security, have been very important to do as we fought and defended our homes and loved ones. First, it was a very clear message of justice, and sending that message not only to perpetrators, but to Ukrainian people. So as of today, for example, the General Prosecutor's Office has already opened 73,345 cases of war crimes and crimes related to war crimes. and additional 16,879 cases of the crimes against national security. Now, we do it in a very transparent fashion. We do it in a very open fashion. We do have excellent support from, and I'm very happy that Ambassador Beth Schaack, who's also a dear friend, is working tirelessly with us, providing support to evaluate the technical and advisory support on how to do it better, how to deal with that magnitude of crimes. And we are also providing the defenders to the war criminal. So we are doing it according to all the rules, and due process of law is there. But it's very important to show people, and it's very important also as a message to Russians, that you will be held accountable for the crimes that you are committing. And maybe it's not only a justice instrument, but also a prevention instrument, so that people who are crossing illegally the border into an independent country, as they do right now, and then commit all this atrocious crimes and war atrocities, that they will know that they will be prosecuted and held accountable for it. Now, in addition to our own investigations, we now have 21 countries that have started their own criminal investigations, and we also share evidence with them. And as we speak, they are investigating these crimes. And on top of that, as you know, starting from February 2022, Ukraine used all the international instruments available to us, from the International Criminal Court to International Court of Justice to European Court of Human Rights. And as early as on March 16, the court has made a ruling for Russia to stop this illegal military operation, which again, Russia as the Permanent Security Council decided to ignore. But it's very important that everything that they're doing after that court decision, they are also doing not only, illegally, immoral, unjustified, unprovoked war, but also as something that has been already reviewed by the international court. So just to summarize, in this situation, we believe that, justice is something that we cannot wait until we win this war. And of course, the priority for us is to win the war, but we cannot wait to work on justice until we win the war, because we believe that this work we're doing now on justice will actually help us, together with weapons, sanctions, and support to Ukraine, to win this war faster.
You just took my follow-up question right out of my mouth, but I'm going to ask it anyway to give you a chance to say a bit more about that. How this relates to the prospects for Ukraine to actually win the war. What is the way in which pursuing a justice agenda, in the specific ways you've described, relates to political and military victory?
Well, very important. Every war, as a military specialist will tell you, consists of a couple of elements. The intent, the capabilities, and the window of opportunities. The intent in Russia to conquer and destroy and completely eliminate Ukraine has been there for the previous hundreds of generations. We Ukrainians fought for our independence since we lost it in 1708, and then we regained it in 1918 with a number of our European colleagues. Then we lost it again to Soviet Union, we occupied, and regained it in 1991. So the intent for Russia to destroy us was no secret to us, and it's unfortunately still there. We just have to listen to Putin and everyone to believe in it. The window of opportunity, they mistakenly thought that it's a good window of opportunity to destroy us again, and we already has proven that not only we not allowed them to have the blitzkrieg and everything else, but there we come to the capabilities and whether they can do that. And of course, it's a function of weapons. So the more weapons we can have, the faster we can get to peace. Of course, it's a function of sanctions, which will decrease the role of Russia, the possibility of Russia to fight, to produce weapons, to continue this war. But this notion of justice, we believe, is a very important element of actually decreasing the capability of Russians to fight. From the top leadership around Putin, who, as soon as they will know that their future is the international tribunal and they will be prosecuted for that, to the soldier on the front line who is sent from Russia to have this, illegal, absolutely unjustified war efforts in Ukraine and commit war crimes, if they know and if they see that justice is something that will not be delayed and will not be denied, and they will be held accountable, we are positive that a number of them would choose rather to go to prison in Russia than to join the effort to fight, or some of the decision makers, because again, this is the most well-documented war in the history, I guess, of humanity, because we see all the decisions of the Russian National Security Council, President Putin, their parliament, and everyone else be taken, and people are voting to support it. Now, we know it's not a democracy where people really vote, but he still tries to do it as if it was a democracy, right? So the notion of justice and working on delivering justice now will stop some of these people from, signing the papers and taking the decisions, because they will see that it's going to be personally for them a responsibility, criminal responsibility for their individual actions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Haber. Same question to you, and I'm particularly interested about if you could speak to the role of third states in relation to this, and in particular because Germany has a very strong record in pursuing basically universal jurisdiction cases. Can you say something about the role of third states such as Germany in this process?
Yes, and I join my friend Oksana in thanking you for making for gathering this group of panelists and for discussing the issue at hand. Now, Oksana Markarova has really made the case very clear why we need to act now. I would add, in addition to what she said about that we owe it to the survivors and their families and the victims and the messaging to Russia, the additional point that with the lapse of time, when we don't register the crimes, when we don't collect the evidence, when we don't document the evidence, memory will fade. So there's no time to lose, really, and that's why not only has our Prosecutor General also opened investigations, we are supporting Ukraine with forensic equipment and with technical advice. We're sending people there to support Ukraine in its endeavor to collect the evidence as quickly as possible. But going beyond that, I think what we'll need is some sort of, shall I say, internationalized tribunal that will address the following issues. The first one is obviously the crime of aggression, something that the International Court couldn't do. We'll have to address the issue of immunity. And we'll have to address the issue of legitimacy. So how to make sure that a tribunal, an internationalized tribunal will carry the necessary legitimacy to address aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And that's where we are right now. We're supportive of that. You have alluded to the fact that we've always been at the forefront of international law and international justice, and we've been a strong supporter, and we are a strong supporter of the ICC. But it is a fact that there would be a gap of accountability if the ICC were to carry the sole responsibility. So what we'll try to focus on is now a solution that will carry legitimacy, that will address the war of aggression, and that will cover the immunity gap that we otherwise have in the context of a national court or the ICC.
At the risk of tripping over my own subsequent question later, I'm curious if I could follow up to ask, so what would concretely, and I know it's very provisional, but what concretely would the architecture that responds to questions of national immunity and, as you say, the legitimacy of a court as a baseline question, what might that look like?
Well, I'm not an international lawyer, and I'm very much aware that there are ongoing conversations about this very topic. There are probably different options to pursue. One would be a resolution by the Assembly General of the United Nations. But as this resolution would not be binding, it could possibly just take the guise of charging the Secretary General of the United Nations to conclude an agreement with Ukraine. But there may be very different options. What I'd like to focus on is what are the solutions we want to see in place. There may be different avenues that lead us to a solution. One of them might be to make use of the General Assembly, but let's focus on the outcomes. It's the outcomes that are most important. Immunity, war of aggression, legitimacy, all of these issues need to be solved.
Okay, thank you. Well, Ambassador von Schaack, Ambassador Haber just noted that she's not an international lawyer, but you are. So I'm going to turn a version of the question to you. So the same question, and I'd like to focus in part on that last section that I asked about, which is the potential danger, at least as some would see it, that pursuing these projects now, for all the reasons we just heard, carry a risk of politicizing in an improper way a project that, which by its nature is supposed to be neutral, a justice-based project. So could you speak to that? And if you like, also to these questions that Ambassador Haber just adverted to about how we arrive at the solutions to deal with questions of immunity and a court that has legitimacy, and I might rephrase that as authority as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's really great to be here. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I've just come back to Washington from Lviv, where the Ukrainian Prosecutor General had hosted a huge conference focused on accountability for the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other atrocities that are being committed within Ukraine. It was very well attended. I traveled with the Attorney General, who we were part of a delegation representing the United States, but many other states were there as well at very high levels, including heads of state, to express essentially support for Ukraine in this battle for its very existence, but also expressing support for the imperative of justice and accountability. And you're identifying this effort as happening now while the conflict is ongoing is really very cogent. Often this is not what happens. Often it is many, many years later, sometimes even, that a society is able to turn to the justice question. But that is not the approach that Ukraine has taken. And I think many of us around the world are really honored to be able to help support them on this journey and this quest to ensure that there is some measure of accountability after the fact, but also, as Ambassador Markarova said, in order to capture the deterrent effect of the law. Whereas maybe President Putin himself is not to be deterred because he has his own grandiose visions of what's underway here, notwithstanding the enormous strategic failure that it has proven to be so far. There are certainly individuals at lower levels who one imagines are thinking twice about whether or not they want to connect themselves to this project and whether or not they want to look for ways to resist. And to take a more moderate approach, and maybe even eventually to defect, and then potentially turn state's witness and offer testimony against the regime that has created this terrible war. So it's been fascinating to see the multiple pathways to justice activate so quickly after February 24th with the reinvasion of Ukraine. So obviously, as Ambassador Markarova mentioned, the Ukrainian courts are open and operating fully. And I'm quite pleased that my office has been able to create this atrocity crimes advisory group with the EU and the United Kingdom. Now it will be opened up to additional individual states if they'd like to support with a capacity building project with the Prosecutor General and his team. The idea is to send veterans from the world's war crimes tribunals to Kyiv and then to field offices around the country in order to work side by side with their counterparts and to bring the kind of expertise that they have developed from the war in the former Yugoslavia, for example, or the genocide in Rwanda, to bear to assist the Ukrainians in sifting through the 75,000 different files that have been created on potential war crimes and other atrocities, help to prioritize, help to make sure they're done fairly, from the perspective of the accused to full due process standards, et cetera. And I think that gets to an answer to your first question is, how do you ensure that this is not politicized? The reality is much of the entire globe is supportive of this accountability exercise, and having experts that are there on the ground working side by side with counterparts will ensure that corners are not cut, that cases are not brought on the basis of vengeance, but rather on the basis of the facts. What do the facts say? And applying that facts objectively to the law. And that's what the Ukrainians are doing now. So that's the first pathway to justice. We should also mention that the International Criminal Court is operating, and Ambassador Haber mentioned this as well. Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, even though it has not fully ratified the treaty that created the court. Nonetheless, they have vested jurisdiction before the court. And there's a very helpful division of labor that's being, as we speak, coordinated between the Ukrainian prosecutor and the International Criminal Court prosecutor. Karim Khan was in Lviv last week. In fact, he visited many orphanages that have now been emptied because children have been deported into Russia and now subjected to forcible adoptions, even though they have guardians and families potentially that want to know where they are and want to know that they're safe. And they're ultimately Ukraine's future that have been now taken and sent into various places within Russia. So the prosecutor general, the ICC prosecutor are working together in a sort of division of labor to think about what cases might make sense to be brought before the ICC versus what cases can be more easily done and more effectively and efficiently done potentially within Ukrainian courts. But then your earlier question articulated a third pathway to justice, and that's third states. So after I left Lviv, I traveled to The Hague, where I met with Eurojust and members of the joint investigative team that has formed amongst the frontline states who are working together to support potential cases in Ukrainian courts, but also elsewhere. And the beauty of this joint investigative team is that it enables these states to share information quite freely, so that if evidence emerges, for example, from refugees who have given testimony in Lithuania or Poland, that evidence can be shared immediately without any need to go through any sort of a mutual legal assistance treaty with the prosecutor general in Ukraine or with the ICC prosecutor, who's also a member of this JIT. This joint investigative team. And so that's the third pathway to justice, this idea of looking to third states utilizing universal jurisdiction and other forms of extraterritorial jurisdiction. So the international community has activated quite quickly, really in an unprecedented way. And we have never seen, not since maybe the World War II period with Nuremberg and Tokyo, or in the mid-90s when the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly the Security Council was able to operate again and was not hindered by sort of tit for tat vetoes, and then the ad hoc tribunals were created for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Those are points in time, and this is now a third one where the international community was virtually united around the imperative of justice. And so that's what we're seeing here with respect to Ukraine.
Let's follow up on that just very briefly. So things like Eurojust obviously are solving kind of a clearinghouse issue in terms of information and coordination. What about the immunity question? I understand that the consensus view, of course, that an international court like the ICC doesn't confront this problem. But if we're talking about national jurisdiction prosecutions, how does one resolve that challenge? That at least for senior leadership, this is going to be an obstacle to pursuing cases.
Indeed. So the standard doctrine is that the so-called troika, which is the head of state, head of government, and foreign minister, enjoy essentially head of state immunity, status-based immunity before national courts. So if Putin were to be in the custody, let's say, of some third state or of Ukraine, it's hard to imagine a set of facts where that might happen, but let's be open to the possibility. Technically, if he's still considered the head of state, he would be entitled to invoke head of state immunity. That does not, however, that form of immunity does not prevent investigations of heads of state. And so all of this work through the JIT, within Ukrainian courts, within the International Criminal Court, all of that can be done during this phase. The ICC is unique in a sense in that it is governed by Article 27, which abrogates any forms of immunity, including head of state immunity. So Putin would theoretically not enjoy any immunity were he to come within the custody of the International Criminal Court. And so that is an argument for exercising international jurisdiction, because as current doctrine and some of the jurisprudence suggests, individuals have not been able to assert head of state immunity in those fora.
Okay, thanks so much. So now I'd like to turn to individual questions. I'm going to go in the reverse order. So Ambassador von Schaack, I'm going to come right back to you. But again, the other two, please, I don't need any of the questions. If you'd like to jump in afterwards, please do. So you mentioned just a moment ago broad global support for these, shall we say, this justice exercise more generally. And I want to ask about the sort of the quality of that support, in particular in the country that you represent. In particular, there's been a lot of discussion about establishing a special aggression tribunal, as Ambassador Haber also mentioned, and that's in part because the International Criminal Court clearly doesn't have jurisdiction over aggression for this situation and for Russia, and isn't likely to acquire it. So what is your view or the United States' view about this? Would you be in favor? I know you spoke very recently in Lviv about supporting such initiatives, but as I read your statement, it's quite carefully phrased, of course, as to what precisely would be supported. Would the United States support such a court focus only on this conflict, or one with a more general jurisdiction over aggression?
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is something that Ukraine has been asking for from the beginning, which is some ability to prosecute what they see as the sort of mother crime or the original sin, which is the invasion and attempt to annex the territory of parts of Ukraine. This is a manifest violation of the UN Charter, very clear parallels with World War II and the war of aggression that was launched by the Nazis and then in the Pacific theater by Japan. And so that was the last time that the crime of aggression was ever prosecuted, was at Nuremberg in Tokyo. And so the Ukrainians have wanted to revive this concept because the facts are so clearly in parallel with what motivated the establishment of the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals back then. The international community is engaged in a number of very high-level discussions in both policy circles and legal circles about what that might look like. And a couple of models have emerged, and that's partly why my remarks were supportive of the project in general and of the idea of prosecuting the crime of aggression and of holding Russia accountable for its acts of aggression, but without precluding any particular model. So there's a range of different proposals that have been put forth. I'll just talk through a couple of them. One of them would involve some sort of a hybrid court, would be primarily Ukrainian, but could involve the infusion of international expertise through judges, through prosecutors, defense counsel, even staff members. We've seen a number of these hybrid courts established in the past, for example, to deal with the crimes of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, or to prosecute crimes in Bosnia Herzegovina that were not being brought up before the International Criminal Tribunal. There was a hybrid court sitting in Sarajevo that was able to take some of those cases. So that's one model. Maybe at the other end of the spectrum would be a fully international court, more like the Nuremberg model, that could be created by way of an international treaty between interested states. The problem with that is, of course, it will take quite some time to stand something like that up, but it's a model that's out there. The second version of an international tribunal would be created by way of a bilateral treaty between Ukraine and the General Assembly. This was done similarly with the Special Court for Sierra Leone that was stood up after their civil war situation. And that could be an international tribunal that could be sitting anywhere. It could sit in Kyiv, it could sit in a third state, it could sit in The Hague potentially, and it could have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression as well. And so at the moment, there is a core group of states, it's called the core group, who are meeting regularly. They'll be meeting in Strasbourg in a couple of weeks in order to explore the sort of pros and cons of these different models. One of the cons of the international model, although it's got its proponents, is cost, how to stand something like that, how to price it out, but also how to garner enough international support within the General Assembly in order to ensure that it has the kind of international legitimacy that's necessary. Now, the last resolution that was put forward on Ukraine gathered 141 yes votes, and a few other states that kind of wished they'd voted yes, I think, and there were some issues with like instructions and this and that. So a nice solid majority. When you speak with some of the states, particularly within the global south, they're maybe less supportive of the idea of establishing a standalone institution. And so there's some concern about whether or not we can whip sufficient numbers of votes. Establishing something more hybrid that's based more in the Ukrainian system would be much quicker, although it would require legislation and potentially some constitutional changes on the Ukrainian side, which is a positive in a sense that it could be done more quickly, a negative in the sense that it would require some legal amendments to the underlying core legal documents. So these are the kinds of issues that are being grappled with in this core group.
Thanks. As I understand it, so a variety of models, institutional models, and of course the question of the support that they might gather. If I heard you correctly, each of these models would be ad hoc in its jurisdiction. That is to say, focused on this case and no discussion. And I think, in other words, if I understand correctly, not support from quite a wide range of actors of states for anything that would look like a general jurisdiction over the crime of aggression now that we're trying it for the second time after 78 years.
That is correct, although I should drop two little footnotes. One would be that Germany and some other states have proposed a kind of a two-track solution. Track one would be to establish an ad hoc institution devoted to this terrible conflict. Track two would be thinking about potentially amending again the ICC statute in order to fix the problem that we're faced here, which is that with neither Ukraine nor Russia having ratified the aggression amendments to the statute, which were added in 2017, there's no jurisdiction before the ICC. So track two would involve potentially exploring whether or not that regime of jurisdiction could be changed. That's obviously a much longer term project, and so it wouldn't make sense as a solution in this particular case, which is why this ad hoc tribunal is being contemplated. I want to just put one more institutional development on everyone's radar, which is the Dutch very helpfully put forward a proposal to create a kind of they originally called it an interim prosecutor's office. They've offered to host this. The idea is to bring together prosecutors, investigators, historians, political scientists, others that really understand the Russian state, what the vectors of power are, who are going to be identified as most responsible for planning and implementing acts of aggression on behalf of Russia, to start collecting that information, collecting dossiers, which could then be handed off to whatever institution ends up having jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. And so it's a very useful sort of interim step, so that, as I think it was Ambassador Haber mentioned, I can't remember who it was, someone was saying how important it is to preserve evidence now while it's fresh. And so that we can start to collect that information in order to make it available to future prosecutions.
Thanks very much. So, Ambassador Haber, I would like to turn to you, and just to note, this German proposal was just mentioned, and if you'd like to comment on that, I'd welcome that. But let me ask the question I was going to put to you, and perhaps you can fold it in if you like. I think they're related. It seems undeniable a year into this war that the UN's security architecture not only failed, but it couldn't not fail. It was not designed to deal with a case like this. Only the Security Council can authorize the use of force, and it includes a response to an illegal use of force, such as Russia's. But obviously the Council can't act when its own permanent members aren't in unison. And the other options, like going through the General Assembly, seem to lack both legitimacy and efficacy, as you alluded to earlier in a related issue. So as the ambassador of an important power that has regularly been mooted as a possible member of an expanded Security Council, what is your view, what is Germany's view about the prospects for revising the formal and effective architecture? Can it be done? What would it look like? We don't have your sound at the moment, I think.
Let me just go back to the question you first asked, and that is the hybrid model. The thinking behind it was we have the ICC, and we're certainly not interested, rather, we are interested in preventing anything that would undermine or challenge the relevance of the ICC. But we do accept that there is a lack with regard to accountability for wars of aggression. The ICC statute simply doesn't cover that. So it would have to be altered, but negotiating a change of the statute would be time consuming and extremely complex. Also, it would, we can't afford to wait. That's why we suggested to support a hybrid option that is caught in Ukraine with international elements. Here again, we'd have the question is in place, what about immunity? How can that problem be solved in the context of Ukrainian court? And there is the question of international legitimacy. That's why I talked before about some sort of internationalized court that would have to be have to be able to solve the issue of immunity, war of aggression, and carry international legitimacy. That's the goal we need to achieve, and that's what the negotiations that Ambassador van Schaack described are about. Now, on the Security Council reform, it's true that the Security Council is blocked. Russia basically Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is also aggression against the Charter of the United Nations. It's a war of aggression against key and foundational principles of the UN system. But we're not able to remedy anything. We're not able to respond to that because the very offender of international law and of the UN system is preventing us from the response. We put forward years ago a proposal to widen the membership of the Security Council. The thinking behind that was that today's geopolitical balance isn't reflected by memberships in the Security Council. And we continue to think that this is the case. But just extending the membership of the Security Council, including, say, countries of the Global South, will not tackle the problem we're confronted with right now, which is the offender of the UN system and foundational principles of the UN system is sitting in the Security Council and will prevent us every time if we want to remedy offenses. So I think to some extent we'll have to think afresh. I'm saying that on a personal basis. I continue to think that a change and an extension of the membership of the Security Council is necessary, not least because we've seen a number of states taking an undecided attitude with regard to the aggression, and expanding membership in the Security Council and including members of the Global South will also do something for the sense of responsibility for foundational principles of international law, such as territorial integrity and sovereignty and non-use of force. So, but it's complex because expansion only, the proposals we've put forward years ago, which were rooted in a different time and in a different set of problems, will not solve the offender problem.
I suppose indeed expansion could actually just make it worse, obviously, by increasing the number of states that could slow a solution down. Do you have any sense, however, of what solutions might look like? So you mentioned fresh thinking. Do you have any more concrete sense of that, or at least of what that process or conversation might look like that could lead to a concrete outcome? That is to say, some sort of revision of the architecture, the constitutional structure of the United Nations, for example.
Well, for the moment, what we're pushing for is an end to the stalemate of any negotiation and of any move forward to make the Security Council more effective and more relevant than it can be right now. But the key problem is the problem of blockade by one member of the Security Council that does not accept anymore the principles that the country itself, as a co-founding member of the UN system, had subscribed to. So that's what we'll have to focus on. And you mentioned it could make expanding the Security Council could make the problems bigger. I think you may be right. But don't underestimate the effect of having a different sense of responsibility once you're in the Security Council for foundational principles of the UN system, in particular territorial integrity and non-use of force.
Well, perhaps for new members. I take your point. Yes. Ambassador Markarova, did you want to intervene at this point?
Yes, I just wanted, if possible, to make two comments on the special tribunal on the crime of aggression and on UN. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so it's going to be a statement as Ukrainian soldier and a person who's affected by all of that, of course, and the representative of my country. But on the crime of aggression, I completely agree with the goals that Ambassador Haber noted on legitimacy, on immunity, on the crime of aggression being prosecuted. Actually, we do have a specific case on the crime of aggression in Ukraine already, because our criminal code has that crime as a crime, and we started prosecuting it, and we already have 641 suspects in that. But of course, as the local jurisdiction, we will not be able to prosecute Putin, and he should be prosecuted because he himself made a number of the decisions specifically of aggression. And of course, we will not be able to change our constitution right now to create anything, because during the wartime, we are prevented from making changes into constitution. And in order to change that provision, we need to make changes into the constitution. So until we win this war, it's very difficult to make changes into constitution. Therefore, taking into account the immunity, the need to prosecute the leadership, the legitimacy also, that's why Ukraine is advocating and trying to convince our friends and allies that actually have an ad hoc tribunal under the UN international tribunal, full-fledged international tribunal on Ukraine is the most viable option if we want to do it now. And we Ukrainians, of course, want to do it now. Now that leads us to the UN. And I just wanted to make a small comment on UN. Because, Ukraine, since 2013, since Revolution of Dignity, has done a number of reforms in Ukraine. And we learned, and all our international friends and partners supported us, and there was a conditionality that if something doesn't work, you have to reform it. Like if something doesn't work and Putin now, essentially destroyed the global security system that was put together after the World War II. And UN cannot do what UN was put together specifically because the League of Nations before that was not able to do it. So that's why you probably know that Ukraine has already initiated formally the process to oust Russia from the UN. And we just have to remind ourselves that there were three co-founders of the United Nations from, the former Soviet Union, Ukraine, Belarus, and USSR itself. And unlike Serbia, which was applying and getting into the UN after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, in the strict accordance with the UN Charter, Russia never did that. Who said that they are to take the USSR place? So, in a sense, I think, their destructive role, their brutal violation of the UN Charter itself, and the fact that they're blocking, I think it's also a valid reason, and I would, challenge IU and the law school to take that as the next topic to discuss and research and put your excellent legal brains together to see what we can do actually to restore the global security architecture, because this war, not conflict, it's not something inside Ukraine, it's not something, it's a clear war of aggression of one country against another country.
I see some of the students from my seminar and class here, so I now know what their next assignment or their final exam is going to be. So we have one more question I'd like to ask you, Ambassador Markarova, but before I do, just to note, we're nearly at the end of the first part of the question, so anyone in the audience, physical or virtual, who has a question should be submitting it now. I've got plenty of extra questions, but I'd rather be reading yours in the next phase. So with that, let me turn to the last question to you, Ambassador Markarova. We're a year into this war, and I think most people assumed it would go very differently at the start. Obviously, it is not now looking plausible that Russia is going to actually achieve a conquest of all Ukraine. But it does seem to me, and I think to most observers, that there are still two very plausible alternatives. One, the less likely, frankly, is a military victory by Ukraine and its allies leading to a total Russian withdrawal. The other, which as I understand is considered more likely by many military experts, including in the United States, is some kind of stalemate in which Russia retains significant control of significant territory in eastern Donbass and especially Crimea. So I would like to ask you about your opinions regarding, shall we say, policy and law, if you think it's relevant, in either of those scenarios. How should Ukraine and its allies accommodate themselves to the fact of persistent Russian control? Or in the event of a complete military victory by Ukraine, what measures should Ukraine and its allies in the international community take to address the very real possibility that there would be many, even millions, of Ukrainian citizens who have long been deeply alienated from the Ukrainian state, up to and including some who actually even now prefer rule by Russia, who would be reabsorbed into the state? So can you imagine any specific policies that Ukraine could adopt to address their concerns, legal reforms, territorial revisions, referenda, for example?
Well, let me at the beginning disagree with the two options that are on the table, and also describe why actually Ukraine winning this war, whether through military or other means, is the only viable option on the table, to be honest. First of all, in 2014, we thought we had these two options on the table, and we were forced to enter into Minsk Accords, and the majority of our partners thought that we have these two options on the table. And while Ukraine has spent 8 years trying to fulfill the Minsk Accords and trying to restore our territorial integrity and our sovereignty through diplomatic negotiations, through all kinds of internal changes including our legislation, Russia has used all these 8 years to prepare for the attack, and they reinvaded us again in 2022. It is very clear to us that with the intent to destroy Ukraine, and this is what it is, with the intent to reconstruct the empire, whether it's called Russian or Soviet or whatever crazy ideas Mr. Putin and the majority of his fellow citizens have, there is no stalemate on the table. There is an operational pause, which Russia would use in order to get their forces together and attack us again. And we already see how it was after 2014. Now, I want to also say that the fact that some Ukrainians might want to live in Russia, it's not also, it's a part of big, campaign that Russia was doing, not only for the past 30 years, but even before, during the Soviet times. If you look at the referenda that was held in Ukraine in 1991, 98% of Ukrainians everywhere in Ukraine voted on average to be independent, everywhere in Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea. And they voted to be independent, and these borders have been accepted not only by Ukraine and international community, but Russia as well. Now, if we look at any point in time, you can find any type of borders in Europe, including our borders, which would be much to the east and include some of the territory which is modern Russia. But unlike Russia, of course, we never do that. We never revisit what it is now. So right now, the choice is very clear. It's either we win, meaning we restore territorial integrity and we liberate all our territories, including Crimea, and we get all our people from the harm's way. Because on the territories which Russia occupies, either after 24th of February, or some territories much smaller, of course, which they occupy after 2014, Ukrainians have been prosecuted, killed, raped, tortured. Our children have been kidnapped. Our priests, whether they are Christians or Muslim or Jewish, are being detained and tortured. So for us to agree to any stalemate or concession of territories, as some people would ask, is essentially to condemn our citizens to die. Now, the majority of people from Donetsk and Lugansk have relocated to Ukraine after 2014, 2015. So, of course, when we during the Minsk process, there has been already developed a number of legislation, of course. How would we reintegrate? And we have a Ministry of Reintegration of the territories, how we would reintegrate these territories after we win and regain full control. And of course, those who participated, I mean, we don't need, of course, the Russian citizens and Wagners and everyone who's there and the thugs and criminals, they can leave to their own country. and they have been, the territories during this time have been massively populated, specifically by this criminal thugs. But, you know, Ukrainians who did not participate in the criminal activity, Ukrainians who did not participate in tortures and killings, there is process of how you reintegrate. And of course, it's a big challenge, especially for those territories which have been under occupation for 8 years, and people were denied the right to study. Like, for example, right now, we know that these children that have been kidnapped by Russians, you know, they are being forced through the re-educational camps before they are put into adoption into the Russian family. So again, the situation in 2014 was very clear for us, but not, I guess, very clear for others. The Shem referendum in Crimea was exactly the same Shem referendum that Russia held in Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk territories now. But I'm very glad that it's now clear, not only to us, it's clear to pretty much everyone except for Russia, that the world is not going to buy their false and disinformation this time. So unfortunately for us Ukrainians, it's very clear. It's either fight and have a chance at surviving, or if Russia is able to win in this, it means that they will slowly and quietly kill all of us. So we have to win this war, and that's why we have to stay the course. And I am positive, again, it's not just a military solution. Of course, weapons are important, but weapons together with sanctions for Russia, together with justice, I think the combination of the three tools, especially if we accelerate and double down on all three of them, will lead to a situation when, you know, some and we will have to win militarily, and some will change not the calculations for Russia whether they want to do it, but whether they will be able to continue their military effort. And hopefully at some point they will see the truth as clearly as we see it now, and they will stop the aggression. The war will stop the moment Russia decides to stop this war and get out from our territory.
Do either of the other two ambassadors want to add anything to that? Or if not, my able assistant here has supplied me with some questions, I think. Or do you want to read them?
I'll be happy.
You can read them. Yeah, there you go.
Thanks, Tim. These questions are not directed towards any particular ambassador, so whoever feels most comfortable should address them. And I'm following the order they were given to me in. The first question is, are we truly seeing global cooperation efforts in support of Ukraine, or more so of the United States and its allies? Whoever would like to take this, perhaps Ambassador Van Schaack?
Yeah, I'll just note what I said before, which is that the last sort of omnibus resolution going forward before the General Assembly garnered 141 votes. So that's a lot of states expressing a condemnation for Russia's conduct, acts of aggression. And there's a provision in that resolution in favor of justice. And so I think it goes much broader than just a small group of European states. Obviously, the Europeans feel quite touched by this conflict on their continent. They haven't seen a conflict like this since the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia, and then prior to that with World War II. But I think that evinces a much stronger set of states that are in support.
Thank you. Would the other two ambassadors like to add a quick word?
Yes, so in addition to the UN strong votes, I'm also representative of Ukraine to the Organization of American States, and OAS has been able to adopt pretty much all resolutions that UN was putting forward, but also already suspended the Russian representative at the OAS, and we have a very strong support from everyone there, from CARICOM, from the South America. Also, you know, the grain deal that Ukraine was able to reach with the UN help in Turkey, but essentially affects a number of countries in Africa, and Ukraine, even during the war, is donating for free, and our partners in the US, in Germany, in Netherlands, in other countries, helping us to deliver this grain to the African countries. I think they see it also more clearly what is going on. And that's why we're able to generate 141, 143 votes. So it's becoming a global effort more and more. And I think a lot of people where Russia had traditionally since the Soviet times, a malign influence, they also see that there is nothing Russians can offer to them now. With their military poorly performing even in Ukraine, with them going to Iran for missiles and for drones, with them trying to get something from North Korea, I think this is a historic moment in time when we all, regardless of whether, it's east, west, south, can clearly see what Russia is doing there and move on.
Can I just
Yes, please.
add here? It's true. The last vote was really a great success. Some might have been worried about growing fatigue, but that wasn't the case in the United Nations. But just a word of caution, we have a lot of work cut out for us, because in the global south, you hear the argument again and again that this is your war, it's Europe's war, it's a regional war, that there was a double standard with regard to wars in other catastrophes in other regions of the world, that you see sometimes the old colonial stereotypes reappearing. So let's not be too self-congratulatory. Let's just accept the huge challenge that we have to keep the global south on board with the very good arguments that Ambassador Markarova pointed to. And let's focus on the principle of territorial integrity, because that's a principle that is very important to many, many states, whether democracies or not. They agree about that. So if we focus on that, if we focus on international law, then we have a better chance on not going down the avenue of this is a regional Europe's war of little interest for the rest of the world.
Thank you. I'll turn to the next question, which is, how do we ensure that public opinion committing to support for Ukraine does not flag or weaken over time? Who would like to take a first stab at that?
I would be happy to.
Please.
So on the one hand, we're very grateful and we have this support from American people, and it's a very strong bipartisan support, which we're very grateful for the support, and also how that support translated into a very tangible support from Congress on the bipartisan basis, from President, from administration. But this is, here I'm going to be like my friend Emily, more cautious that this is something that we have to continue explain to people and work hard. Because in democracies, and both of our countries, all of our countries are democracies, we have to explain it to people. We have to explain it to all the stakeholders. So when I'm asked, why the US has to support, like how to explain to people, why is it important for the United States? Well, first of all, what Russia is doing is exactly what the Soviet Union was doing. And Russia is undermining now not only the security in Europe, but global security. They're challenging the international global infrastructure, and the global situation in which there will not be peace in Europe, there will constantly be turbulence, is not going to be a situation in which the countries actually can thrive and develop and provide more for their population. Even blockade of the Black Sea and the grain and the sunflower oil from Ukraine already led to a massive effect on the global markets and the increase of prices and shortages of the products. Imagine if it goes on longer and longer. From the security perspective also, Black Sea and the region is very important for NATO countries. How can you ensure the security in the region and globally if an aggressive autocratic nuclear power will control more territories and will control the sea that is so important for many in the alliance? The third is also, like in any national security paper in the United States, Russia is a threat, and Ukraine is now decreasing that threat. And we are decreasing it at a much lower budget than ever was put together in order to contain the Soviet Union. And third, very important, we have to listen to Putin. He is very clear about the fact that it's not only about Ukraine for him. Of course, he's obsessed about Ukraine, but it's not only about Ukraine. And if, God forbid, Ukraine falls and he gets further and he attacks either one of the Baltic states or Poland or any other NATO ally country, then it's an Article 5. And unfortunately, all of the NATO members will not only have to provide help with financial resources and military, but also send people to fight the war. Ukraine never asked and never will ask people to come and fight for us. We will defend our country ourselves. We only need tools to do that. So I think it's in all of our interests to actually show that, bullies cannot just go and beat and kill whoever they want to, that good people can also defend themselves. And this is what we are doing. And that's why we have to send a very strong signal, not only to Russia, that they cannot do what they do, but also to others who might look at Russia and see whether, this is something that they might do and violate their neighbor, violate the territorial integrity about which Emily just was talking.
Thank you. Unless the other two ambassadors wish to weigh in.
Actually, I would, if I may.
Please.
Now, as far as Europe is concerned, and certainly my country, I do not see a growing fatigue. And that is because the war obviously affects us directly. This war of aggression is a revisionist war trying to alter the borders of Europe. And if that war were successful for Russia, I think the entirety of Europe would be affected. As far as the United States is concerned, I hear two arguments from those who are more critical of the American engagement and the massive American support for Ukraine. The first argument is, why don't we focus on what is important for us in the United States? Why don't we focus on our infrastructure, etc.? And the second argument is, why should we be doing something when Europe doesn't do a thing, especially Germany? And I'm saying that because this is completely untrue. Europe is affected by the war in ways America is not. We are massively supporting the Ukraine militarily, in civilian terms, humanitarian terms, by receiving refugees. And as far as Germany is concerned, within the EU, we're the biggest military supporter of Ukraine. We are the second largest supporter next to the United States. In a civilian and humanitarian context, we are hosting 1.2 a million refugees in Germany from Ukraine. And I'm mentioning all of that because if the plea is being made to withdraw support for Ukraine because of a lack of support from Europe or Germany, well, then the argument is unsound.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Van Schaack, any quick intervention?
I would say, I think a lot has been said, and honestly, at some level, one only needs to listen to Oksana to realize how important this is to be continuing the levels of support that the international community has shown. It's an attack on Ukraine, it's an attack in the midst of Europe, and it's an attack on all of the principles that the whole UN Charter was established to protect. Not only state sovereignty and territorial integrity, things we think about when we think about states, but also the right of every single one of us to live a life of peace and dignity. This has been violated. I was in Lviv, and now several days later, the city is under attack and it was out of power. And, if those days had been several days sooner, the whole conference would have been potentially targeted. And you had many people there who were supporting accountability. It would have been a terrible target, actually. If you wanted to take out some of the best minds working on the accountability brief, that would have been the hotel to take out. It's unconscionable. It's what Russia has done in terms of disrupting the life paths of so many people within Ukraine who just want to live their life, who want to raise their children, who want to do their jobs. And instead they're escaping to bunkers. They're having to be rendered refugees across an international border. And so I think just hearing from the reality of what life is on the ground will only serve to continue to maintain levels of support, because no society should experience what Ukraine has experienced here.
Thank you. This question is helpfully addressed to all the speakers. and it goes as follows. Justice implies the ability to impose penalties or enforce sanctions. Ukraine must win the war for this to be true. How can a negotiated settlement yield justice? Or am I misunderstanding the meaning of justice? Who would like to go first?
I can go first.
Please.
We also believe that Russians should pay for, not only as the justice measure to pay for what they've done, but also they should pay for the future reconstruction of Ukraine. And yes, some of it can only be done at the end of the war and when we win the war and hopefully negotiate something, but we don't know right now how the war will end. But there is a lot we can do now. So first of all, there is a lot of sanctions that imply also freezing and seizing of the assets. And we already had, thanks to the new legislation that was adopted in last December, and the DOJ already has confiscated the first 5.4 million. That doesn't sound like a huge, but it shows the path of how to do it from Malafeev, one of the Russian oligarchs, that DOJ has confiscated and has actually, according to the law, transferred to the Department of State, which now also has the authority to provide it to Ukraine. We have adopted a resolution under UN with approximately 90, I don't remember the exact number of countries, 93, I think, countries supporting it, on the compensation mechanism, so that there will be a registry, not only of damage, which now is being done by the World Bank, the rapid DNA damage assessment of what is destroyed in Ukraine and what have people lost and how many people, what is in numbers. But also, we have a number of countries working on sanctions and on freezing the Russian assets, sovereign assets, and the assets of those who are responsible for it. And that is, taking that, confiscating and giving it to Ukraine for the future, very responsible and transparent reconstruction or for compensation to people is also justice. And we don't have to wait until the war is won to do that. But of course, after the war is won, that's when we can discuss all types of, reparations and, different types of justice in contributions that could be discussed, but it's a bit too early now.
Thank you. Would the other two ambassadors like to chime in? Or are you happy to move on to the next question? Thank you. This is a question about the reform of the UN Security Council. Are there legal precedents or laws that would allow a body to exclude one member or to declare its decisions unanimously, irrespective of, I'm afraid it's a bit mangled, irrespective of one member's opinion, if that member is in violation of the principles of the body is founded on? It was a bit of a convoluted question, I fear. I can read it again if necessary.
I think part of what the question is getting at is just how unconscionable it is to imagine a permanent 5 member of the Security Council engaging in this kind of behavior. But we have to remember that this is very similar to what we've seen in other military engagements by Russia, including with respect to Syria, which it supported its client state there, terrible war crimes, crimes against humanity being committed there. Russia is very much implicated in supporting the Assad regime, and then blocked any efforts before the Security Council to impose any measures of any consequence on the Assad regime, including sanctions, including an ICC referral, et cetera. So I think implicit in that question is the sense, that was raised earlier about, the real abuse of the privilege of being a permanent 5 member of the Security Council.
Yes, Ambassador Haber.
Well, including the aggression now against foundational principles of the UN Charter, right? So there is, it's mutually exclusive, at least in logical terms, to be a member of the Security Council of the UN system, and at the same time attacking and invalidating its foundational principles. It's why I said before, in this situation, we have to think afresh how to dissolve the phenomenon of mutual exclusivity. So there again, I'd say that the listeners, the students, have work cut out for them in terms of strategic thinking, how this could be tackled.
Ambassador Markarova, do you want to add a sentence, or are you happy with what your colleagues have said?
Well, as non-lawyer, I can only add, if we ask any, primary school teacher how to deal with bullies, they will give us a very clear recipe. You do not reward bad behavior, you punish for bad behavior, and you reward good behavior, right? So Russia has been behaving and doing the crime of aggression not once, not twice, but a number of times. They attacked Ukraine in 2022. They attacked Ukraine in 2014. They attacked Georgia in 2008. They committed crimes against people on the flight MH17. They poisoned people in the UK. They kill brutally people in Syria, and we can go on and on and on. Now, whether it's, how to oust Russia because of the brutal violation of the statute, and committing the crime of aggression, or revisiting, as I said before, whether they should have been there in the first place, and there are legal grounds for them to be a permanent member to start with. I think this is a task, professors, for the bright legal minds to put together and think about something. What is clear, I think, for everyone, lawyers and non-lawyers, that this situation cannot remain as it is if we want to have the global security infrastructure, and if we want to have UN as a very capable provider of the international justice.
Thank you. Well, this being a university, I'm not surprised that the next 2 or 3 questions are a bit contentious, or can be at least construed that way. The first of these is as follows. To many Russians, any talk from the US of war crimes seems to reek of hypocrisy, given the present debacles. The recent debacles of US foreign policy, the Gulf War, hardly a paragon of international legality. Why should Russians not talk of US war crimes as inconsistent and hypocritical? I think this is perhaps best tackled by Ambassador von Schaack.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that sort of like whataboutism and false equivalency is pretty typical of what a lot of states will do when the spotlight is turned upon their own human rights violations. They'll say, oh, well, look over here. Nobody's focused on this one. Or, oh, what about this back in the past? Nobody's focused on that one. The reality is the rules apply to everybody, and we should all be working, all of us, to provide justice and accountability for all of them. And so the attention is now on Russia because it's the greatest breach of international peace and security happening at the moment. But we should be working towards justice all places. I've been to Bangladesh, for example, where there are almost 1 million Rohingya refugees who have fled across an international border or been literally shoved across an international border to preserve their lives. They care deeply about what's happening in Ukraine, and I saw Ukrainian flags there, but at the same time, they don't want the world to lose sight about what happened to their community and what they would face if they were to return. Likewise, other places around the world. And so selective justice is an unfortunate reality of the international system, and we should all work to rectify it in whatever way we can.
Can I follow up on that just for a second? So I want to try the question in a different way, not about hypocrisy. I understand your argument to that, and I'm not going to go in that direction, but you mentioned that the rules apply to all of us. And I want to push you a bit on that. and in terms of where we go with this. So this is sort of the question of building this. And I want to draw on a few points that were mentioned earlier. The question whether this is a war for Europe and by Europe, a European war. It was mentioned also the Security Council structure is defective. That, of course, is a design feature and a choice of the system we've built. And it seems that there's no way to change it. I agree, you've got to think afresh because there's nothing inside the existing structure that would allow its reform. And so I return to this question of the rules applying to all of us, because I'm not sure that's actually true at the moment. I don't know where those rules would be applied to any of the major powers. Let me read you something from the last time we tried this. 1945, Justice Jackson, in his opening statement at the Nuremberg Tribunal, said, because he was addressing the crimes against peace and understood the obvious awkwardness that one of the judges had recently itself engaged in aggression, the predecessor to Russia today, and he said, while this law is first applied against the German aggressors, the law includes, and if it is to serve a useful purpose, must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit here now in judgment. That means the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. That's 78 years ago. And if I understand correctly, to this day, there is no court in the world with jurisdiction over any of those four countries. We're now discussing building an ad hoc court to have jurisdiction over one of them, the successor, Russia. But as I understood your answer earlier, we're not actually doing anything more than having possibly on the German model a conversation about what a next step would be. So this is my question. Are we just permanently ad hoc, or is there any indication that we are actually building towards a system in which the rules would apply to all of us, because they don't now?
Well, we have an international criminal court that actually does have jurisdiction over France and the UK. They've both ratified the statute. So
but not for aggression, right? Because they have the
not for aggression. No, I mean, very few states have ratified the aggression amendment. So this is a question of political will and whether or not states want to adopt those new provisions, and they're doing so slowly. But it's a question of whether it's ultimately to the political will of those states to decide whether they want to ratify those amendments, which would then vest jurisdiction not only against their own persons, but also it would help lay the foundation for acts of aggression that might be committed against their own territory as well. So that's a question of whether or not there's going to be an uptick in those provisions. Again, yes, in this particular case, we are considering an ad hoc option because there isn't a permanent institution that has jurisdiction, but every little brick in the wall that one builds around justice and accountability and against impunity is creating greater expectations around the imperative of justice. And so, we didn't have a UN charter, now we do. We didn't have an ICC, now we do. We didn't have ad hoc tribunals, now we do. And so there are these steps towards creating a more holistic and comprehensive justice system across the globe. And the fact that we have third states that can exercise jurisdiction over the commission of international crimes wherever they have been committed by virtue of principles of universal jurisdiction also helps, I think, to create more of a complete ecosystem of international justice.
We are at the time that you promised, and we have a lot of questions left. So I think it's a question for the ambassadors whether they have a minute or two more for Šumit to ask another question.
I have about 30 seconds more, unfortunately. I don't know about the others.
Well, since we were in the vein of asking awkward questions, and Tim preempted me with one, I'm going to ask you, Ambassador Van Schaack, a particularly awkward question in the spirit of the university's commitment to free inquiry. Just this morning, while reading the New York Times, I noticed that there was a story which indicated that one of your colleagues in the Department of Defense, specifically Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, apparently is temporizing, and not just temporizing, actually holding back intelligence on Russian war crimes to be shared with Ukraine for fear that at some point this might come back to haunt the United States, that American soldiers might be exposed to similar kinds of claims or allegations or charges. How do you respond to this?
Well, I think just to be clear, I think the story was not sharing information with the International Criminal Court.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, it's not a question of whether or not information is being shared with Ukraine. There is a memorandum of understanding that's precisely for that purpose with respect to Ukraine. So I think just
It's with the ICC. Okay.
it's with the ICC. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I mean, that story is out. There's an internal deliberation happening, and it hasn't reached resolution.
Thank you. Tim, are we?
I think we're at time, and I know that some of the ambassadors have to go, so perhaps you should thank them.
But may I also make a quick comment before you thank us on the crimes, and I think it's not fair to compare what Russians are doing to any even war crimes that can happen with any military and which are being prosecuted and people are being held accountable if there are some rogue people who do this. But in this case, and I think you should just visit Ukraine or watch the documentaries and evidence which is out there to see that it's not just rogue units that do something bad in Ukraine. It's all of them, all Russians. It's a systematic torture, systematic war crimes on our territory. They have nothing to be there. I mean, the crime of aggression is a crime. And everyone who pressed the button today, for example, to send this more than 80 missiles into Ukraine, killing, Ambassador Van Schaack already said, whole families in Lviv Oblast, because they were sleeping in their houses. People who killed and put people in the mass graves with their hands tied behind their back, executed, into the people who are raping children, This is a war crime after war crime after war crime. And seriously, I don't think we will find any war where a whole country engages in a war crime for 378 days. So, the justice should be everywhere. The rules should be applied everywhere, and people should be prosecuted for this. But here, it's a systematic war crime, crimes against humanity, genocide effort by the whole country, from the president to the last soldier on the front line.
Thank you very much. I am mindful that your time constraints are severe on all three of you, particularly at this very fraught moment. And so I am exceedingly grateful that all three of you managed to carve out this time to spend with us. We hope to host you on our campus in person at a more propitious occasion. And I want to apologize to those members of the audience who submitted questions, but sadly, we have run out of time. We tried to make the most efficient use of our time as possible, but all that really remains for me is to thank the three ambassadors, to thank Christian, to thank Professor Hannah Buxbaum, who's the Vice President for International Affairs, and above all, I've been quite remiss in not mentioning Jessica Hamilton, who initiated this entire process in the very first place almost a year ago. And it has finally come to fruition. And obviously, I need to thank my colleague, Tim Waters, for sharing the podium with me. This has been an absolutely extraordinary and enlightening event. And once again, I would like to reiterate my commitment to finding a way to having all four of you, including Christian, on this campus in flesh and blood. Thank you so very much for this unique opportunity.